From 2600 Talks, I'm Tom O'Brien. I'm Sky News Canberra's Bureau Chief. On this podcast, my colleagues and I bring you all the action from the nation's most powerful postcode, 2600. Thank you for your company once again. But before we dive into this episode, please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to this podcast on your favourite podcast platform. It helps all of us bring you a much better show. Welcome back to another edition of 2600 Talks. Every week we're joined by, a prominent member of Australian Parliament, and I'm pleased to say making his 2600 debut is Liberal Senator James Paterson. Senator, thank you very much for your time.
Tom, thank you for having me.
Lots of issues we can start on, but let's start on religious discrimination, because the government's promised Religious Discrimination Act, probably a step closer after Cabinet approval this week. What we're hearing so far is that it's going to protect people in areas of employment and services from being denied opportunities based on their faith. But what at this stage the Religious Discrimination Bill doesn't currently do is protect or positively protect all manners of action, such as freedom of speech, which I know is something you've called for. From what you've seen and heard so far, does this go enough?
I'm very happy with the way that the Attorney-General, Christian Porter, has been running this process. He's been running a fantastic, open, consultative process with backbenchers like me who have an interest in this issue. And my interest goes back a couple of years to the same-sex marriage debate, where I authored a bill and then a series of amendments to more robustly protect religious liberty, but also freedom of speech and parents' rights and charities and schools. There are certainly some people who advocate a positive protection of religious liberty rather than a more orthodox Religious Discrimination Act. I don't think that's a good idea. Effectively, what you would be doing if you did that is enshrining a one-clause Bill of Rights. And the problem with Bills of Rights is that they effectively hand over power that currently rests with the Parliament to the judiciary. And there's a number of reasons why I think that would be a really dangerous path to go down.
You have been on the record, though, in wanting to see complete freedom of speech protected. In your view, what does a protection for complete freedom of speech look like?
Well, in this space, one of the areas of concern is that, for example, the Archbishop Julian Porteous from Tasmania, during the same-sex marriage debate, authored a pamphlet that said, that was titled "Don't Mess with Marriage," and it outlined the Catholic Church's teachings on marriage, which is obviously a belief in traditional marriage. Now, I was actually an advocate of same-sex marriage, so I didn't agree with the pamphlet, but I strongly defend the right of the Catholic Church or any other faith to be able to articulate their vision on moral or religious questions. And what happened with that booklet, though, is that the Archbishop was taken to the Anti-Discrimination Tribunal in Tasmania under Tasmania's anti-discrimination law on the basis that what he said about marriage was offensive to people, to gay people. Now, that's a really troubling thing. In the end, that case was never settled. The complaint was subsequently withdrawn. And the problem that causes is it's not actually legally clear, at least in the state of Tasmania, whether you can publicly espouse your view of a traditional version of marriage without legal recourse being taken against you. That's not a good thing. I believe that you should have complete freedom of speech to advocate for same-sex marriage and also complete freedom of speech to argue against it if that's your conviction. And I think we lose not just the right to free speech, but also religious liberty when that happens.
And this idea of complete freedom of speech, I know the balance we've been talking a lot about lately is, the freedom for employers to be able to have contracts that protect them, and also the freedom of workers. And obviously the most high-profile one here is Israel Folau to, express their views. Is the type of legislative protection you're looking at something that resembles something that would have actually protected Israel from dismissal by Rugby Australia?
It's certainly of concern to me, and I think many other Australians, that employers are increasingly trying to control what their employees say outside of their work role and outside of work hours, and sometimes in ways that don't even relate to their employment, that are unconnected in any way to their employment. So I think Israel Folau is entitled to espouse his religious and moral beliefs as a public sportsman and should not be fired as a result. A separate and more difficult question is, what can the law do to tackle that? Well, we don't really know where his case is going. He's taking action under the Fair Work Act, and he may yet be successful under that act act of claiming that he's been discriminated against on the basis of his religious beliefs. So we have to kind of wait and see what the outcome of that is. But it's a tricky area for law. Should we prevent an employer from being able to have any control over what their employees say on social media? I think that would be going too far. But should we allow an employer to have complete control over their employees, what they say outside of their work? Well, I think that's problematic too, because our public square will be significantly diminished if all of us as citizens effectively have our speech controlled by our employers, whether they're government employers, non-government employers or private sector employers.
I guess to play devil's advocate, the difficulty here is if we flip the other side of the coin, if the employer is a religious school and the employee is, someone who may be, a groundskeeper, a cleaner, and they're actively speaking out against the faith of that particular school, surely what protections then exist for an employer as a religious school to kind of hire and fire their staff based on, particular issues that may arise from some, disgruntled staff for speaking out against the actual tenets of their employer?
My personal view is that there's a happy middle ground here that can probably resolve most of these issues, and that is that an employer should be entitled to restrict the speech of their employees, but only in a very limited way, only in a way in which it's actually relevant to their employment. If it's not related to their employment, I think it should not be acceptable for an employer to try and control the speech of their employees. But if it is directly relevant, then of course they should be able to. And that I think is the happy medium here.
Well, we'll see what comes out of this. Apparently, Cabinet has ticked off on this bill. You no doubt will see it when it comes before the Coalition Party Room in the September sittings. Meanwhile, the Australian Law Reform also currently examining possible exemptions for religious organisations from Discrimination Act. So a lot more in this space. We'll move on, but no doubt conversation will keep happening, Senator, over the coming years. A different issue, if we can quickly, rise in superannuation. There's about 8 or 9 Liberal backbenchers who have been quite, high profile recently, discussing concerns about the rise in compulsory super guarantees from 9.5% to 12% over the coming years. The Scott Morrison has allegedly told you guys in the party room that it'd be better if these conversations were had in the party room and not had in public. But we've got very clearly now that a group of backbenchers are concerned about the rise in superannuation. Clearly you're concerned about this so much so that you and Amanda Stoker and others are going to keep speaking on about this. Where would you like to see this go? Obviously you don't want to see the rise.
Yeah, Tom, I first wrote about this issue in a column in the Financial Review about a year ago, before the last election, where the government was considering a range of changes to superannuation in response to the Productivity Commission's report. And one of the things the Productivity Commission said is that we need to review our retirement income system and the way that superannuation is working before we contemplate increasing the compulsory guarantee, which is currently 9.5%, up to 12% as it is currently legislated to do. I think that's a really good recommendation of the Productivity Commission, because effectively what we're doing is we're forcing employees to put away a very significant proportion of their income that they may actually prefer to spend on other things. They may prefer to spend that on their current financial priorities. It might be their mortgage, it might be their kids' school fees, it might be further education for themselves. They've got a range of financial pressures. So we should make sure before we contemplate doing something like that the system is working and that it does serve the best interests of workers. Because at the moment I think there's a really big question about whether that's true or not. Independent research from people like the Grattan Institute shows that if you increase the amount that an employer is required to pay on behalf of their employee into superannuation, it comes at the expense of their take-home pay. And there's a lot of workers, particularly in the environment we're in now with relatively low wages growth, who don't want to see any slower increase in their wages, let alone a fall in their wages, in order to have higher superannuation in the future.
So where to from here on this, Senator? There's currently a retirement income review that's about to get underway. You no doubt would like to see this review really kind of closely look at this issue and potentially recommend something that you and your colleagues support.
Well, I think we should be guided by the evidence. The Prime Minister has said that he's happy for the review to look at issues like this. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the results of that review are. And I hope that the review is guided by the evidence, and I hope the government considers the evidence very carefully when it's released. Because ultimately that's what we should be guided by. What does the evidence show? What will the impact be on workers? Are they going to be better off as a result of a change like this? And if they're not, what should we do about it?
Moving on, Senator, it seems these last few weeks has really been dominated by foreign affairs, particularly the issue of China. Scott Morrison will spend this weekend in Vietnam, where kind of China and its expansion into Vietnamese waters is very much the subtext of the trip. And then again this weekend at the G7, which is, a good opportunity for Australia at the G7 forum, where no doubt, China and trade tension and all these issues will be spoken about, no doubt. You've been pretty high profile on the issue recently. You've supported your colleague Andrew Hastie's intervention in the debate, warning Australia to look at the global response to the rise of China. You've also been speaking about the threat of free speech on university campuses, particularly with the rise that we saw last weekend of these Chinese student protests against the Hong Kong protests. I know you've got a history in this space, particularly in terms of the Australian attempt to have an extradition bill. You spoke out against the extradition bill when Malcolm Turnbull first proposed it. It ended up being dead in the water. What were some of the issues there? Are there similarities, you think, between what Australia was potentially walking into and what Hong Kong is currently potentially walking into there?
Tom, I think this really is the issue of our age. As the Prime Minister said in an interview this week, it's one of the things that keeps him up at night and one of the things that all Australian Prime Ministers are going to have to spend a lot of time contemplating in the years ahead. But as you say, it's not just an issue that's come up in the last few weeks with Andrew Hastie's contribution, but actually it's been bubbling under the surface for a number of years now. And of course, we first confronted, I think, one of the most high-profile parts of this issue, which was Australia considering its own extradition treaty with China in March 2017. I was, at the time, a relatively new backbencher. I'd been in the Senate for about a year, and the government had a long-standing negotiated treaty with China, which it sought to effectively ratify and seek the approval of the Parliament to agree to in March 2017. I was wary about this because the truth is that the Chinese legal system is not a just and free legal system like our legal system is. It doesn't observe the same conventions of the rule of law and the presumption of innocence and proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, Chinese prosecutors boast that they have a 99.9% conviction rate in their criminal justice system, and that's not a criminal justice system by any Western standards. So I was concerned that an Australian citizen or a citizen of another country under our care could be extradited to face an unfair legal system. And I was concerned that even if no one was ever extradited under this treaty, that the fear of the possibility of being extradited would be a very powerful tool to use to intimidate, for example, the Chinese diaspora in Australia and ethnic Chinese Australians. And I didn't want to see that happen. So at the time, I notified the government that I was uncomfortable with this treaty, that I would be very reluctant to support it in the Parliament. Corey Bernardi, then a Conservative independent in the Senate, was proposing a disallowance motion to nullify the treaty, and I said that if it came to it, that I may need to cross the floor and vote for that disallowance motion. In the end, the government, I think very wisely, decided that it should withdraw the extradition treaty. And a lot has changed in those 2 years. I mean, 2 years ago, this is before the Sam Dastyari affair. At the time, it was still legal for foreign companies and individuals to donate to Australian political parties. We hadn't yet passed foreign interference laws. So there's been a really big shift in thinking on these issues in the last few years. But I think that's a salutary lesson for Australia.
And just finally, Senator, a bit of a question without notice. Your Victorian Senate colleague, Mitch Fifield, is, leaving the Senate. He's off to New York to the United Nations, leaving a vacancy in the Senate for the Victorian Liberals. Bit of a hotly contested race, including from Sarah Henderson, the former Corangamite MP. Who would you like to see join you in the Senate? I
have to say I'm sad to see Mitch go. He's a former employer and mentor of mine and a friend, but I know he'll fly the flag for Australia very proudly at the UN. I know he'll be a fantastic advocate for our values in that forum. I'm leaving this matter of his replacement, though, completely up to the members of the Victorian Liberal Party. I don't have a vote. There's about 450 branch members in Victoria who do, and really it's their job to decide who they want to send to Canberra. It's not my job to tell them who they should send to Canberra. It's up to them to exercise their judgment. It's an open democratic contest. There's about 7 candidates, and I'm sure that the party members will make the right choice.
Further north in New South Wales, though, probably a more hotly contested race for who's going to replace Arthur Senadinas. Jim Molan, I know one of your colleagues and someone you get on well with. Would you like to see him return?
I'm even more loath to comment on a pre-selection in another state than I am to comment on one in my own state in Victoria. I wish all the candidates all the best, Jim among them. I'm sure he'll put his case confidently to the members, but ultimately it's up to those members to decide who they want to represent them.
Senator Paterson, we'll keep an eager eye on who joins you in the Senate in the coming months, and we thank you very much for joining us this week on 2600 Talks.
Thanks for having me, Tom.